We continue now at the top of Daf Vav Amud Aleph and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 6a. On the previous summit, the Gemara brought a brisa which said that an animal that's a treifa cannot be brought as a carbon, and that is learned from a pasuk. And the brisa said, why can't you learn from a kal v'chomer? What do we need a pasuk for? Because there is a kal v'chomer. The kal v'chomer is that just like a baal mum, an animal that's a baal mum, that's something which is mutter lahediot, but it is asr legavoa. Baal mum cannot be brought as a carbon, and so therefore for sure treifa, which is asr lahediot, a treifa is not kosher, so certainly it cannot be brought as a carbon. And the brisa went on to say, well, if the kal v'chomer is refuted in some fashion, so that's why we have the pasuk. And the question among the Amoraim is, what is the refutation of the kal v'chomer? And on the previous summit, Rav Ada bar Abba suggested that a refutation could be from kilayim, because kilayim is something which is asr lahediot, that's referring to shatnez. One is not allowed to wear shatnez, but in the big day kahuna, by the avnate of the kohen, so there we find that kilayim actually is permitted. And so therefore you see that there is such a thing where lahedjot it would be asr, but for the Beis Hamikdash or for gavoa it could be mutter. But the Gemara continues and says you can't refute from kilayim because kilayim is unique. Ma'ala kilayim shemitzvaso bekach. Kilayim is unique because that is the nature of the entire mitzvah. And Rashi explains kilayim legavoa again refers to avneto shel kohen. That refers to the avnate of the kohen. And the shita mechubetzes over here says kohen gadol, refers to the avnate of the kohen gadol. And then the Gemara says mitzvaso bekach. The mitzvah is that way, meaning gezeres hakosav shelo yehe avnate elo shel kilayim. There's a gezeres hakosav that the avnate should specifically only be from kilayim. D'chsiv, as it's written in the pasuk, tchelas v'argaman v'arminan midashesh kisna tchelas imra. Again, we say over there that it's linen and wool, and so therefore that's mitzvah. So bekach, that's why kilayim is unique. It does not necessarily refute the kal v'chomer. And the Gemara continues. Rav Shisha B'rei Rav Idi Amar Rav Shisha, the son of Rav Idi, says that misham diikol amemar, one can say in order to refute the kal v'chomer, lahader dina v'teisei b'mahatzad, that you can have a mahatzad ma'ala malika shekain kiddushasa osarta. What we say is as follows: just like by malika, there, as we said on the previous amud, kiddushasa osarta, it's the very thing which makes it kadosh. That very malika, which is what makes it aser. Let's say it's lahediot, and chayla v'dam yochichu, but chayla and dam prove the other way. They don't have that unique quality. But ma'ala chayla v'dam shekain boim mechlal heter. But chayla and dam, as we said in the previous amud, they are boim mechlal heter. The whole rest of the animal is mutter. It's only the chaylev and the dam that are aser, that are forbidden to eat. And malika tochiach, malika goes the other way. V'chazar hadin, and so then we go back and forth, and we need to find the common denominator. Lo roi zeh karoi zeh, lo roi zeh karoi zeh. This is not like this, and this is not like that. But hatzad hashavah shebehen. But what is the common denominator among them? Sha'asurin lahedyor umutarin legavoa. Those are aser lahedyor, and they're mutar legavoa. Afani avi treifa. So too, I could have included treifa. Afal pisha asur lahedyor. That even though it is aser for a hedyor, it's aser for a regular person to eat treifa, to hey mutaris legavoa, it should be mutar legavoa, and so therefore that essentially would refute the kal v'chomer. Here we have an example, a tzad hashava, which is asur lahedyor and mutaris legavoa, and therefore I might have thought again that treifa was mutaris legavoa. That's why the pasuk is needed. But again, the Gemara says mal tzad hashava shebehen. But when it comes to the common denominator of what we just had above, shekain mitzvasa bekach, again that is something that is mitzvasa bekach. And the idea is again that by both malika and by chaylev and dam, that is the nature, the very nature of the mitzvah. And so therefore again, that is what is unique by chaylev and dam and malika, and it does not necessarily prove, it does not necessarily carry over to treifa. And Rashi explains, Rav Shisha B'rei Rav Idi Amar, Rav Shisha B'rei Rav Idi says, Lahachi itzrich krad, the reason why we need a pasuk specifically to say that treifa cannot be brought as a carbon, mishum deikol amemer, because one could have said, Nahader dina v'naisi b'mahatzad, we could use a mahatzad to treifa mutaris legavoa, the treifa is mutaris legavoa, and again, the Gemara brought the tzad hashava, but then the Gemara said again, it could be that the tzad hashava also has a unique factor, and so again, we are back to the question as to why it is that we need a pasuk. Why not just learn from a kal v'chomer, from a baal mum, an animal that's a baal mum? And the Gemara continues and says, Elo Amar Rav Ashi, rather Rav Ashi says, Mishum deikol amemer meikara dedina pircha. We can say from the very outset that this kal v'chomer that we are making from baal mum, we can refute it, because mehecha kamaisis lo. Where are you trying to bring a source for saying that treifa is aser legavoa? Mi baal mum, you're trying to make the kal v'chomer from baal mum. The whole idea is that baal mum, that animal, is mutter for a regular person, and it's aser legavoa. So for sure, treifa, which is aser to a regular person, should be aser legavoa. But we can say that baal mum is unique. Mal baal mum shekein asabo makriven kekreven. When it comes to baal mum, the makriven also there's halachas of blemishes, meaning the halachas of blemish. The halachas of blemishes, those halachas apply to animals, but they also apply to the kohanim, and therefore that is a unique halacha in general. We cannot necessarily learn treifa from there. And Rashi explains, makrivin kekravin demum pasal bekohen kemo bezevach. A blemish is disqualified by a kohen, just like by the animal that's being slaughtered. Aval treifas lo pasal bekohanim. We don't find treifas as a disqualification by the kohanim. Tetanan bebechoros beperak mumin elu. We learn in the Mishnah bechoros ve'elu ksherin ba'adam ubsulin bebehema also v'yaspano utreifa v'yotzei dofin lahachi etzrich krug. And we find that treifa by kohen is fine. And in any case, that's why you can't really learn from balmum, and that's why a pasuk is needed. But the Gemara continues, Amarle Ravacha Sabal or Saba said to Ravashi, Yotze Dofen Yochiach, an animal born by cesarean section, that can prove the other way, meaning that can undo this uniqueness, this unique quality of Balmum that Makrivin Kekravin. Shalo Asabo Makrivin Kekravin, because an animal that's Yotze Dofen, that halacha of Yotze Dofen, that halacha doesn't apply to the Kohanim like it applies to the animal. It only applies to the animal. Umutter Lehedyod Vyasr Legavo, an animal born by cesarean section is mutter to a regular person. It's permitted to a regular person, and it is asr legavoa. It's asr to be brought as a carbon, and so therefore that proves that it's not because makrivin kekravin. That is not the reason why balmum has that added stringency that it's asr legavoa, and therefore again we should be able to make the kal v'chomer from an animal that's a balmum to an animal that's a treifa. The kal v'chomer remains intact, but the Gemara says no. Mali yotzei dofen also has a unique quality. Shekena eno kadosh bebechora. The halacha is that an animal born by cesarean section, if it's the firstborn animal, it doesn't have that kedushas bechora, it doesn't have the sanctity of the firstborn animal. But balmum yochiach, but again, balmum can prove the other way, because balmum is kadosh bebechora. But mala balmum shekein asabo makrivin kekravin, as we said, balmum also has its unique quality that the makrivin are treated the same way. They have the same halacha of balmum. The kohanim have those halachas, and yotzei dofen yochiach, yotzei dofen can prove the other way. But then we're back to atzad hashave v'chazer hadin. It goes back and forth. Lo roizeh karoizeh v'lo roizeh karoizeh. This uniqueness is not the same as that uniqueness, and that uniqueness is not the same as this one. Hatzad hashavah shebehen. But again, we have a common denominator now. Shemutarim lehedyot v'asurim legavoa. They are both mutter for regular people, but they're asur legavoa. They cannot be brought as karbanos. V'kol shekein treifa. And then we're able to derive treifa from there. An animal that's a treifa, shasura lehedyot, that it's asur to a regular person, tehei asura legavoa. Therefore, it should be asur legavoa. We should make a kal v'chomer. If that which is mutter lehedyot is asur legavoa, that which is asur lehedyot should certainly be asur legavoa. And then we are back to our question: why do we need a pasuk to teach this by treifa? Isn't it able to be derived through this tzad hashava? But the Gemara says maybe the tzad hashava is not so good. Mala tzad hashava shebehen, because the common denominator, we have a different common denominator between balmum and yotzei dofen. Shekein lo hutru michlalan. There's no situation where there's a heter, meaning to say there's no situation where there's a heter legavoa, an exception to the rule. Tomar b'treifa shehutru michlala. When it comes to treifa, there is an exception to the rule, as we'll see in a moment, and therefore, again, since there is that exception to the rule, maybe you cannot have this limud through the tzad hashava. Amarle Ravacha brei de Rava Ravashi. Ravacha, the son of Rava, said to Ravashi, treifa shehutra michlala mahi. Where do we find that there's an exception to the rule of the prohibition of a treifa? Ilema malika de'ola sa'of. Maybe you'll say that when malika is done, so technically speaking, malika done in an animal is in the category of a treifa. So let's say malika is done by a bird ola, legavoa, but that's hutra michlala. Legavoa, that's actually allowed. That animal is allowed to be burned on the mizbeach, so that's hutra michlala. There's an exception, there's a time where it's permitted. But the problem with saying that is the balmum nami ba'ofos ishtarui ishtri. When it comes to balmum as well, let's say by a bird that has a blemish, that also is permitted. So it's actually, it also is hutra michlala, because there's a halacha of tamus v'zachrus b'vehema. The halachas of tamus and zachrus, that you can't have a blemish and it has to be male, those halachas apply by animals. Vein tamus v'zachrus ba'ofos, but those halachas do not apply by birds, meaning there is no halacha of blemish. So you do have a hutra michlala in that situation. And so the Gemara instead says, well, here's a hutra michlala, ella, rather, malika dechata sa'of la kohanim. When it comes to the malika by a chata sa'of, not by the ola sa'of, but let's say it's a bird carbon chatas, there the kohanim actually eat from the carbon, and so there, it's an exception, it's in the category of a treifa, but it's still allowed to be eaten by the kohanim. But the Gemara says that's not a proof either, because Kohanim mishulchan gavoa kazachu, because the Kohanim, they're really eating mishulchan gavoa once it's permitted to go on the Mizbeach, so then the Kohanim are allowed to eat mishulchan gavoa. And so the Gemara continues and says, V'ela parachachi, rather we can ask like this, we can ask as follows, Mal hatzad hashava shebehen shekein mumon nikr, when it comes to the tzad hashava, meaning when we're talking about Baal Mum, when we're talking about Yotzei Dofen, there the mum, the blemish is nikr, it is recognizable. Tomar b'treifa, whereas by treifa shekein ein mumon nikr, it is not a blemish which is recognizable, therefore it cannot be derived from the tzad hashava. Mishum hachi itzrich kran, it's for that reason that the pasuk is necessary to teach that the treifa cannot be offered on the Mizbeach. And Rashi explains, Zamar le Rav Acha Saba le Rav Ashi, Rav Acha Saba said to Rav Ashi, Ve'akati, still lamali kra, what do we need a pasuk for? Again, by an animal that's a treifa. Ha'ikol amemar, we can say, Yotzei Dofen yochiach, the Yotzei Dofen proves the other way. Shakohen Yotzei Dofen kasher li avoda, because if a Kohen is a Yotzei Dofen, born by cesarean section, he's still kasher for the avoda, to do service in the Beis HaMikdash. The Karban Yotzei Dofen pasel, and a Karban that's a Yotzei Dofen, that's disqualified. Damrinan b'Toras Kohanim, ki volid prat li Yotzei Dofen, that's what we say in Toras Kohanim. And then the Gemara said, Mali Yotzei Dofen she'eno kadosh bebechora. Yotzei Dofen is unique. There's no sanctity of bechora there. De peter rechem ksiv, because it says peter rechem, it has to be the one that opens the womb. Tomar betreifa shekedusha bebechora. When it comes by treifa, there is holiness of bechora there. Im nolad im treifaso, if it's born with the treifa, with that wound, hilkach itzrich kra. Therefore, the pasuk is needed. But then the Gemara said, Baal Mum yochiach. Baal Mum proves the other way. Shekadosh bebechora. That has the sanctity of bechora. V'asr legavoa, and it is forbidden legavoa. Afani avi treifa, so I can also include treifa. Again, v'lam likra, what do we need a pasuk for? Hatzad hashava, again the question is v'lam likra, what do we need the pasuk for? And Rashi continues and explains, malika treifa he, really malika is in the category of treifa, as we said, lechatchila dechotech shedru mefarekas, he's cutting those parts of the animal by the neck that make it, by the spine, that essentially make that bird into a treifa. Kedamrinum perakama, deshchitas chulin v'hutra legavoa mechlali surah lehedyot, and it is mutter legavoa. Again, that's supposed to be offered on the Mizbeach, even though in general a treifa is asur lehedyot. Ishtri afani avi treifa, so too I can include a treifa. And Rashi continues, the Gemara said, malika dechatas ha'of lakohanim, when it comes to malika by chatas ha'of, that's permitted for the kohanim, and so therefore that's an exception to something that is asur. Uve balmum v'yotzei dofen, now by balmum and yotzei dofen, loeshkachan heter lakohanim, mechlal isr, we don't find that there's an exception that it's mutter to kohanim when in general it's asr. De'ein ben shum isr legave kohanim, there is no isr to kohanim in that situation. And Rashi continues, mishulchan gavohu dezachu, again when it comes to the malika of chatas ha'of for kohanim, they're getting from the shulchan gavoa. V'gabe gavoa eshkechan bebal mum ba'ofos heter mechlal isr, and as we said, when it comes to gavoa by bal mum of ofos, we do find a heter mechlal isr, because again there's no concept of bal mum when it comes to ofos, and therefore v'lekel lemifrach mal hatzad, you no longer have the question, the refutation of mal hatzad. V'lam alikran, we're back to our question, what do we need the pasuk for? And Rashi continues, bal mum muman nikr, when it comes to bal mum, the mum is nikr, it is recognizable. She'ein muman pasel ela begolui, because the disqualification is only when the mum is out in the open. Kedamin and bechoros beferak aleilu muman, like we say in bechoros. V'yotzei dofen, and also cesarean section, mumo nikr, that's also called mumo nikr. Why? The islay kola, because there's a kol goes out, everybody knows, v'hakol yodim, everyone knows what happened, that it's a yotzei dofen. And finally Rashi says, treifa yesha ein mumam nikr kagon b'vnei mayayim, when it comes to treifa, sometimes the mum is not nikr, it can be in the b'nei mayayim, in the intestines, and therefore again it is not nikr, and that is why a pasuk is needed. And the Gemara continues and asks, so treifa mehacha nafka, is treifa really learned from over here, from the source brought in the previous Amud, that's the pasuk of min habakar, but mehasam nafka, it's learned from over there, it's learned from the following pasuk. It says in the pasuk, mimashke Yisrael, and we mentioned this earlier, that min hamutter li Yisrael, that a carbon can only be brought from that which is mutter. And we have another source as well, a third source, mikol asher yavor tachas hashavet, this is by Meiser Behema, it says it has to be able to pass tachas hashavet, it has to be able to pass under the staff. Nafka, it's learned from there, prat l'treifa she'eino veres, that excludes a treifa which is not able to pass, it doesn't have that strength. And the Gemara says, Strichi, it's necessary to have all three sources. The Imi Mashki Yisrael, if we only have the pasuk of Mimashki Yisrael, of Mashki Yisrael, have Amina Lemu'ute Hecha, the Lo Haisala Shas kosher. I would say that excludes a situation where it was never kosher. There was no moment that it was kosher. Dumya de Arla v'Kili HaKerem, similar to Arla and Kili HaKerem, from the very outset, they were not kosher. Aval Haisala Shas kosher, but let's say it had a moment where it was kosher. Eimatis kasher, maybe I would say that it's kosher to be a carbon. Kasav Rachmana Kol Asher Yavor, that's why the pasuk says Kol Asher Yavor. V'Kasav Rachmana Kol Asher Yavor, if the pasuk only said Kol Asher Yavor, have Amina Lamute Hecha Dinitrifa Ulevasofik Tisha, I would say that pasuk is excluding where it was a treifa first and then it was consecrated. Dumya de Meiser, that's similar to Meiser, by the case of Meiser Behema. Avalik Disha Levasof Nitrifa, let's say it was consecrated first and then became treifa. Deveina de Aktasha Havachazi, at the time that it was consecrated, it was fit to be a carbon. Eimatis kasher, one might say that it is kosher. So Kasav Rachmana Min Habakar, that's why the pasuk writes Min Habakar, and so Tzrichi, that's why it's necessary to have all three sources. And Rashi explains, Shalo Haisa Lo Shasa Kosher means it didn't have a time where it was kosher. The Nitrafa Mimei Imo, let's say it was a treifa in the womb already. Dumya de Arla v'Kili HaKerem, that would be similar to Arla and Kili HaKerem. Dechsib Ba'ukra, they're mentioned in that pasuk. Dechsib Min Atzom, Min HaMasayim, Mimashki Yisrael, V'Aminim Min Perek Elu over, Meseches, Psachim, Min HaMasayim, Min HaMuter Beis Meos, Shenishtayru Bebor Mikan L'Orla, Shabbatla B'Masayim. We have a source over here from this pasuk of Batla b'Masayim, that it's nullified in 200th by Arla, and so therefore again I would say similar to Arla and Kili HaKerem. Kol Asher Yavor Tachas HaShavet Prat L'Treifa She'eno Veres, the pasuk of Kol Asher Yavor excludes a treifa that's not able to pass, Mishum De'en Lachias, it doesn't have life, Lo Chashav Lo Veres, that's not called passing. V'Hai Krok Siv V'Meiser, that pasuk is written by Meiser. V'Gaminan Shar Karbonos Minei, we learn other karbonos from there, B'Gzeira Shavet, through Gzeira Shavet, Nemar Kan Tachasimo, V'Nemar Lahalan Tachas HaShavet, Beperek Test the Bechoros, this Gezeir Shava, it says over here Tachasimo, it says over there Tachas HaShavet, that Gezeir Shava is in the 9th Perek of Bechoros. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Echad Minchas Chote v'Echad Kol Menachos, whether by the Minchas Chote, the Mincha of the sinner, or all Menachos, all carbon Minchas, Shekams on Zar, if a non-Kohen takes the Kmitza, the fistful, or Onen, Tvol Yom, and Onen is an acute mourner, Tvol Yom is somebody who immersed that day, but he's still Tameh. If those individuals take the Kometz, Mechusar Begadim, Mechusar Kippurim, somebody lacking the Big Day Kahuna, somebody is Mechusar Kippurim, which means lacking atonement, again, he's not fully purified, Shalo Rachatz Yadav or if he did not wash his hands or feet, Aril if he's uncircumcised, Tameh if he's impure, Yoshev if he's sitting, Omed al gabe Kalim al gabe Behem if he's standing on top of vessels or on top of an animal, or al gabe Ragle Chaver or on top of the feet of his friend. In all of these cases, Pasul we say disqualified. Komatz bismol, if he takes the kometz, the fistful, with his left hand, Pasul it's disqualified. Ben Beseira Omer Ben Beseira says Yachzir, he should return it, V'yachzir v'yikmotz biyamin, and then take the kometz again with his right hand. Kamatz v'yala biyado tzror, if he does the kmitza and in his hand there is a small stone, a pebble, or gargar melech, or a little bit of salt, or korsha levona, or a pinch of frankincense, Pasul in those cases it's disqualified. Mimnei she'amru, because they say hakometz hayeser v'hachaser, Pasul if the kometz is extra or it's lacking, it is disqualified. Ve'ezel hayeser, what's considered extra, shekamso mevoretz, that's if it's overflowing, and v'chaser, what's considered lacking, shekamso barashe etzba'osav, he uses the tips of his fingers to diminish the kometz. And Rashi explains, Zor v'yonen v'chol hani mefarish bezvachim, all of these cases are explained in Zvachim Mikroi from Sukkim, the Avodasam Psula, that when they do the Avodah, it's disqualified. Vaz horosan b'Sanhedrin b'sof Elohen and Nisraf, in the warnings in Sanhedrin. Orel Kohen Orel, and Orel is a Kohen who's uncircumcised, and why? Shemesu Echav Machmas Mila, his brothers died because of having bris milah, so he never had a bris milah. Yoshev, if he's sitting, Lamod L'Sharis Ksiv, it says he has to be standing to serve. Al Gabi Kalim, Al Gabi Behemo, Regel Chaveru, he's standing on top of something. Bizvachim Mefarish, and Zvachim it's explained. The Ba'inan Shaloye Davar Chotzitz Ben Raglav Levein Haritzba, there can't be anything separating between his feet and the floor. Samol with his left hand, Mefarish Begamar Minol, the it puzzle? The Gemara will explain from where we know that's puzzle. And then the Mishnah said that Ben Beseira says, Yachzir v'yachzor v'yikmotz b'yamin, he has to return it and again do the kmitza with his right hand. And Rashi says, Akulu polig. Ben Beseira is actually arguing on all of these cases, Azor, v'onin, v'chol hanach, on the case of the non-kohen, the onin, etc. Again, return it and do the kometz again. Ala biyado tzror, if a pebble comes up in his hand, nimsa kometz chaser, so then the kometz is chaser, it's actually missing a little. Makam hatzror, that area of the tzror does not count. V'chein melech olavonin, the same is true by the salt or by the frankincense. Mevoretz is godush, mevoretz means it's overflowing. Lishnachrina shenira kemach chotzetz bein roshay etzba'osav lepaz yado. Another way of understanding is the kemach, the flour, is chotzetz between the tips of his fingers and his hand. And Rashi continues, beroshay etzba'osav, at the tips of his fingers, ma'at, meaning a little bit is removed there. Shalo pashtu al pas kol hayad, again it wasn't spread throughout the entire hand. And the Gemara says, Lamali lamisna echad minchas chote ve'echad kol menachos. Why does the Mishnah phrase it as whether a minchas chote or all menachos? Just say simply, listen, kol ha-menachos, just say all carbon minchas shekams on zar v'yonin, which the kmitza was done in this manner, it's disqualified. And the Gemara continues and answers Rabbi Shimon Itzrich. It needs to be phrased this way according to Rabbi Shimon. The Tanya, as we learned in a Brayso, Amar Rabbi Shimon says, B'dinhu shatei minchas chote te'una shemenu lavona. It would make sense to say that the minchas chote, the mincha of the sinner, does require oil and frankincense. Shelo yeh chote niskor. We don't want the chote, the sinner, to profit, to benefit. If it's not going to require as much ingredients, that would be a benefit. Umifnei ma'ina te'una. And why does it not require shemen and lavona? Shelo yeh karbonu muhuder. We don't want that his carbon should be beautiful. Rashi explains, Shelo yeh karbon muhuder shelo teh mincha. No, we don't want it to be a nice carbon mincha. Uvedinu shetei chatas chaylev tuna nesachim. And really, the chatas chaylev, that's a chatas brought for the sin of consuming chaylev, which is forbidden fat, that should require nesachim. It should require libations. Rashi explains chatas chaylev hainu stam chatas. That's just a way of referring to a regular carbon chatas. Chatas eina tuna nesachim. In general, a chatas does not require libations. Beperek shtei midos. That's in perek shtei midos later on, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Vav Amid Beis.